Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the DXM podcast. I am your host, Colborn, and we are live today with artist Connie Bakshi. Connie, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
We are super honored to have you, and we are going to go on this journey in the same place we start every time, which is giving you a bit of space to talk about yourself, your practice, and how you came to be in crypto art and NFTs.
Sure. I'll start with my journey into art, which is actually stemming from a complicated relationship with language. I grew up in an immigrant household with two first languages, English and Taiwanese. And, when you live between words and worlds, there's a lot that goes unspoken. And so that could be things that go on in the household or outside of it. So I think for a lot of my early life, I was a quiet kid. I didn't have a lot to say, but mostly because I just didn't have the words to express a lot of the experiences I was going through. But it actually wasn't until I started out as a classical pianist and then ultimately as a biomedical engineer working in neuroscience, where I was trying to understand the development of language in the brain, that ultimately I started finding ways to express these invisible narratives. But really, it was when I got my hands on AI that I found this vernacular to talk about the invisible experiences that are so unique to a subjective life, and that typically go unsaid and unseen. It's ironic because so much of my AI process in an interface that's so text-driven is one that comes down to codifying and recodifying language itself to try to unearth these hidden narratives and expressions. And so, I found my way into Web3 and the crypto art scene really from a logistical standpoint first, because, inherently, the outputs that you're getting from AI are digitally native. I'd spent some time in the New York art scene. I came out of the New Museum's New Ink incubator, and was really seeing this issue with finding a place for digital art, for it to be shown, really for it to just be shown and seen. And so, I kind of took my first foray into the NFT scene just as a way to get my work out there. But then as I just did more research and just tried to wrap my head around what the crypto art scene was really about, I saw this world or an ecosystem that was nascent and emerging. And there was just so much talk about how, we had this chance to build something new, right? Mm-hmm. And we didn't want to necessarily carry over these behavioral economics and ideologies from legacy capitalism into a space like this that we have so much control over, right? And so, when I started seeing work of some of the OGs like Rhea Myers and Kevin Abosh and what they were doing to kind of talk about these issues, I realized, oh my gosh, this is the place I want to be, because so much of the themes in my work, like this is exactly what I'm talking about. So really, that's kind of how I found my way into the scene and really jived with it.
I love that. I want to, before we dive into kind of where we are in that journey, I'd love to talk about more of the immersion themes in your practice, the conversations between you and the technology, the latent spaces that you're looking to explore, and then maybe we can tie it in kind of to the broader crypto art conversation, if that's okay.
I'd love that. That's great. When I first started working with AI, to kind of give you some context, I was introduced to the technology by a friend of mine named Phil Boshua, who at the time had his hands on some of the most cutting edge models between the conversational models and a lot of the image synthesis models. This is probably back in early 2021. And, you know, he at the time, I think we were in kind of still in pandemic mode. You know, I was kind of thinking about my practice and where I wanted to take it in a kind of come to Jesus moment that we all had, right? And, you know, he essentially said, you know what, let me put all my tools in your hands. I want you to just play and see where you go with it. And what was really interesting was, you know, at first I was going at it from a lot of different approaches and just trying to get some specificity out of the machine and its responses. But ultimately, I found I had to scrap all my conceptions of what my relationship to the machine is and could be. And I essentially embarked on a really intimate relationship with AI between these conversational models and these image synthesis models.
That's fascinating. I am, you know, how do you feel about kind of, to me, it feels like there's almost an AI arms race going on. I've seen like a lot of AI artists in the beginning almost drop out because they don't feel like they have access to the latest models or the latest technologies. Everything is progressing so incredibly fast. I'm curious how you as an AI artist perceive this and are kind of dealing with that.
You know, arms race is a really good way to put it. I feel like it's a global race to get to the tip of the spear when it comes to the technology. Yeah. But what I've found, you know, certainly I had access to some of the earliest models in a way that a lot of artists didn't. But I've found that I'm more recently playing around in things like Midjourney and open source models, Stable Diffusion, because they have so many different things to offer, you know, and really for me, it's not about the novel technology itself. It's about what are the conceptual themes that I'm exploring at the time? What are the questions that I'm asking? And what are the right tools to address those? You know, certainly we all know the McLuhanism, the medium is the message, but I also think the message is the message. And really when you're working with AI, you have to understand first, like how to communicate with the machine to get a very unique conversation going. But also you just have to know what you want to say.
What are your thoughts on how these tools are opening up more broadly to people to be able to explore those feelings that they haven't been able to put words to?
I've talked to a lot of other AI artists. I mean, obviously there's quite a bit these days. But I've gotten some really amazing feedback from people who say that, one, it's opened up a new mode of expression for them because there's, you know, depending on what tool they're using, maybe they're using Midjourney, right? And they're eking out these variations and these reiterations, and then suddenly they see an image that just resonates with them at a gut response, and they're like, "Oh, that's what I was trying to say." And there's something very beautiful about that feedback loop that comes out of that conversational process. And I'll keep reiterating like feedback and conversation because I think that's crucial. And they're discovering things about themselves that they hadn't even necessarily thought about, but only emerged from the process. So I think that's a very unique, you know, asset and value that comes out of working with these technologies.
I feel it is almost like Freuding and delving into the subconscious, and so much of like the iterative, again, like feedback that you are getting almost from like a Rorschaching test.
There's certainly an element of Rorschach, yeah.
yeah. It's and like dreamscaping and exploring. I mean, for people to be able to begin to like put concrete images and synthesize their imagination and all of these things, it's totally new territory, and it is wonderfully fascinating to just, I think, be on the edge of this space. I'm curious how this also begins to bleed into perhaps the way you would hope for people to be maybe having metaverse experiences or digital experiences online. And if there is a way to perhaps open it up to something that is bigger than just the individual communicating with the machine.
Absolutely. Something that I've been thinking about and talking about a little pretty recently is, thinking of, all right, let's see, we get these outputs from the machine and that are predominantly visual, right? But we're living in a context where this kind of art is being mediated by a flat 2D digital screen. And the phrase that's been kind of circling around in my brain is digital homunculus. And this idea that, okay, what's interesting about AI is that it's subject to the knowledge and experiences and memories that we've documented and imbued the machine and its data sets with, right? But it does not have the sensory processors to understand the tactility of things like smell. And even, I mean, certainly there's some generative music that's now going into AI, but sound, smell, taste. So now when we're living in either in the metaverse or even just within a digital screen, how are our cognitive processes geared for the senses now being reshaped by this new kind of mediation? And really, I think, it's a really fascinating study to just see how AI perceives these senses and expresses them, because I think, it's living in a black box or in a dark room, and we're just essentially sending it, the film and the chemicals and the stuff it needs to process, but it never experiences these on its own. So I think I'd love to see how the tactility and the visceral experience of being human and being a physical entity starts to now translate into a digital experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course it makes sense. It's yeah, it's incredible. I mean, of course, I don't know how much work you've done in VR, but that was always some of the strangest experiences. Like, you see the person and they have like, a face, but you can't like read the emotion, and you reach out and you just like kind of go through them. There is none of that tactile nature, but you can see and hear them. And it is, I think, more empathetic than kind of just the flat screen that we've all grown so accustomed to, but how we really do continue to like merge closer and get closer to ourselves and one another through all of this augmentation is well, it's a bit of a cybernetic playground.
It is, but it really speaks to how we're now forming emotional intimacy, right? Not only with ourselves, but with each other. And I think, well, I'd love to see how that kind of emerges.
Yeah, and I think this is actually an interesting segue, because I don't know, but I think we might have similar thoughts on like Web 2 and capitalism, and how this could be like a new open playground to explore something else. So maybe I'll start and I'll just say, I mean, there's not really a question there, but I'll start and just say, like, in the beginning, it was full of these like wonderful visionaries, luminaries, people that really wanted something different, that saw so much promise in the technology. And I think over the past 2.5, 3 years, it's really just been co-opted, beaten down, like reduced into the like purest extractive capitalist individualist form that it almost could take. And I think we're seeing almost the death knell of it. And maybe, I guess, like the question now is, one, where does it go? And is there anything like new and promising at this point that can escape like capital's reach?
Yeah, I think a lot about how our technologies are incorporated in these corporate and capitalist infrastructures. And, specifically with AI, I'm seeing like so much of what drives the dynamics, the economic dynamics is, we always talk about the algo in very vague terms, right? The Twitter algo, these different predictive algorithms that are ultimately co-opting a lot of our decisions and taking our agency away from us. And, forgive me if before I go down this road, forgive me if I sound like I'm drinking the Kool-Aid of AI and algorithm technologies. That's certainly not what I mean.
That's presumed, that's presumed.
Okay, fine. I'm drinking the Kool-Aid.
Right.
Okay, so this idea of predictive algorithms, in the AI space, this is something that's been harped upon for years now, since kind of the emergence of the technology. But what I'd love to kind of pose is this idea that the technologies in and of themselves are not necessarily flawed. The processes of the technology are not necessarily flawed, but it's how they're being utilized. And I'm thinking, if we start thinking about less about turning the gaze of the machine towards prediction and more about thinking about them as perceptual algorithms, where it's about understanding our own complexity and the complexity of our infrastructures, and really finding ways to highlight our blind spots. I think that's an interesting starting point for how we might start to shift the needle. But then also for me, I'm thinking about things like there's a trope of a phrase that I hate to use, but cognitive bias. Outside of these systems, we are still influenced by invisible ideologies that are oftentimes passed down through generations, right? And that's why a lot of my work actually is, even though I talk about, I look at these systems with a critical eye, I frame my work in the form of lore and ritual, because these are things, for instance, that through repetition and through time have originally, they were originally deemed acceptable, and they were imbued with values that were, considered worth repeating, right? But there's a point where generations down the line, these values essentially become stale and stagnant and aren't relevant to our times and the complexity of the world around us. So I think really understanding not just the technology's bias, but our own biases, and deconstructing those, I think we can start looking forward with a much more realistic perspective, and one that's much more inclusive and that acknowledges the force and understands the forces and the powers and the systems that are shaping us.
Ooh, a lot there to unpack. I, again, in those 3 years, saw a ton of also cultural and tradition degradation, the inability to pass down things like, if you made a big sale, go support other artists that were, that kind of you want to lift up as well. And, there was a sense of decorum and respect, and now it just seems like everything all at once, digital garbage everywhere, just create, consume. And that was tough to watch. So I sit back and I wonder how it can be rebuilt, but I'm curious to you, what are, of course, kind of the positive standout aspects of this technology, and how might it be more ethically or thoughtfully incorporated into where you would like to see this go?
You mean blockchain technologies or AI technologies? Blockchain.
I was speaking, more blockchain. Yeah. I think both are interesting.
Well, the blockchain itself is and the social dynamics are inherently linked to not legal contracts, smart contracts, not legal, but social contracts, right?
Yeah.
I've started seeing, promising, counters to that. Let's say, for instance, Operator, Deja and
Wonderful.
Anya's
Yeah.
work. I think it was Let Me Check with the Wife. That was
Yeah.
one where it was kind of upending the notion of the smart contract. But I think outside of the contract, you have to look at it systemically, right? And it's not just about individuals. I think individuals incorporating a specific practice, but it's about how can you galvanize and gather multiple stakeholders across the strata of Web3 to enact something that's much more systemic. And I think we just have to kind of think bigger about who are the allies and the strategic partners that we can get in place to make bigger moves and make more of an impact. It's not a singular decision.
Yeah. I like that a lot. I had really no traditional art world experience. I did not understand the infrastructure of the traditional art worlds. But as I kind of came into this space, I really saw how people were hurt really by not having that infrastructure that almost like slows the process down, that draws the art out, that has different points of like discussion and validation and storytelling to help them lift up their story. And that is something that, exists outside of what is that serotonin hit attention economy.
Yes.
And I think is exceptionally valuable. So I think you're right, going out, finding those partners, finding those institutions, building coalitions, like even just having some sort of system other than, utter reliance on just that smart contract.
And I have to say, I was recently part of an event and exhibition called FemGen that was in Art Basel, Miami. And this came out of a partnership between Vertical Crypto Art, Nicole App, and Right Click Save with Alex Esterick, but also Art Blocks. And what was really fascinating about that experience was that it was looking at how, women in the generative art space just simply are not banking the same market value as men in the space. And you can see the numbers. They're transparent. They're right there on the ledger. Yeah. But the entire exhibition and event was about, let's look at this problem systemically. First, let's in the creation of this event, let's gather together the right partners who believe in committing to lifting up this marginalized demographic, right? But then it also became about, okay, how can we centralize these women, these key women in the generative art space now, display their work, and allow them to speak and take the stage so the world can ultimately see that this group and their work has such undeniable value. Yeah. And, I'm still getting a lot of feedback from the event about how incredibly impactful it was, not only for the artists and the organizers, but for people who experienced it, firsthand, where it didn't even occur to them that, this was an issue, Yeah. So I think that's kind of one of the sparks of promise I've seen in the space that utilizes this kind of strategy.
And I know you I think, did a show with Vellum. Yeah, I have to shout out Vellum, who almost a year ago now, I went to their space and they were showing women, an exhibition on women and creative coding. That was just exceptional.
Artists Who Code, yeah.
Artists Who Code. That was a cool show.
Lindsay, Alice, they've really built up a dynamic community of digital artists around their gallery, but they're also I think they're very committed to lifting up voices and art that just isn't necessarily on a global radar, Yeah. And that particular show that I was part of was called Next Gen LA, mm-hmm. Which was about looking at emerging artists digital artists coming out of LA. And, I was personally floored by the other talent in the room. And I was like, how could I not know about you guys, you know? And the fact that Vellum and and of course, so Cindy and Jesse Damiani had curated that show, but they were also incredibly instrumental in drumming up support and getting traffic into it so that more eyes could see the amazing art coming out of these artists. But yeah, so yes, Vellum, love them. Like, they're incredible in everything that they do. So I think we're on the same page there.
Yeah. Some good names we're tossing out for people. Check them out. They're in LA, and yeah. So maybe we can switch the question now over to kind of broader implications for AI in kind of these systemic designs, and how you think people can, again, just like begin to ethically and incorporate these tools into their lives.
I think the big catchphrase in AI right now is Chat GPT, and I think it's a model, conversational model, that certainly boasts incredible natural language processing that's very humanistic, and the catalog of information it references is also incredible. But you know, in so many of these conversations I'm seeing, people are still looking at it from a Q&A standpoint. And I think that's, they're looking at ChatGPT and these conversational models as if they're doing a Google search, you know, and in a lot of ways, I think looking back at even Web 1, like Google searches have essentially are a little bit mind numbing over time. I mean, you're essentially like putting in these queries and you're getting a response and you're accepting them as fact, right?
Sure.
And I think that's a possible, not to start with something cynical, but that's a possible danger that I think we can encounter with tools like ChatGPT. But I think one of the incredible promises of it is that, you know, now having this instantaneous connection with these broader knowledge bases, can we start to think at a higher level, right? Can we think beyond information? Can we and start thinking about, you know, how do we not only perceive but process and separate truth from fiction? And I mean, I think this is a similar question that was raised when deepfakes started coming out, right? But I think this is the mindfulness that I'm hoping these kinds of technologies will start to trigger. You know, can people move beyond being fed information and fed responses and instead look back and question the responses themselves? Does that make sense?
It does make sense, yeah. I think where it begins to scare me a bit is, what I found in the early crypto art community that really excited me was just the amount of just questions, right? And the ability and the art that was like questioning. And I loved like the rebellious spirit of it. It goes back through all of crypto, right? If nobody had devised an alternative currency system to the one, well, then you have to use the one. So, you know, what scares me about ChatGPT is that there is no ability to choose. You're just given something, right? And theoretically, everybody would almost be presented the same thing, which I don't know. I just get nervous when people continue to export like critical thinking to a machine and critical thinking skills. Yeah,
I think that's definitely a fair phobia. I think I'm a little bit personally biased myself because every time I encounter a new model, whether it be conversational or image-based, like I'm essentially finding ways to hack the language to give me incredibly anomalous responses, because it's the anomalies that say much more about the inner workings of the machine and its processes and the data sets than anything else. So in a lot of ways, I think there is a certain rebellion in how you interact with the machine. And for me, my rebellion is in finding the anomalies.
Is that in a bit of a bit of a cyberpunk tradition?
I wish I was so cool, but no. I think once again it just goes back to language. I'm early on I was playing around with the phrase abstractions of language and words, and playing around with double entendre and innuendo in a way that the machine just in a way it kind of started to stutter and couldn't figure out what specific definition to give me. So it kind of gave me something in between, and that was kind of magical. And then now I'm not putting in specific queries or prescriptive language. I'm always playing in abstraction. I'm actually using a lot of poetry these days, and like looking at the structure of those kinds of that form to once again find ways to recodify the language that I'm putting into the machine. So I think what's so interesting that the AI models are so reliant on text-based interfaces. Language is now the means by which we can hack the system. And I find it a little ironic, but that language and words have historically kind of been the site of hegemonic control.
I wanted to,
especially in our world.
yeah. I mean, I wanted to explore this with you because it seems that like the default language is English, right? And I know you talk about this, right? The difference between like Taiwanese and English, and what can be expressed and what like has been expressed. And I'm of course super fascinated. Well, like maybe we can move beyond words and we can start to communicate with images, and we can start to communicate more, I guess, symbolically. And I mean, are you finding that there are limitations, or that there is a constraint that like English being the predominant language of usage for these models, I presume, is having?
I mean, yeah, that's certainly problematic, but I will say that like let's even GPT-3, they started incorporating a lot more global languages. It's certainly not comprehensive. I've spoken with friends who have used their native languages to integrate with image synthesis and conversational models, and they're getting very different things too, which is interesting. And I feel like at some point I'm going to have to collaborate with one of my friends and just look at these, kind of do a side-by-side comparison of the process, the outputs based on how the language is structured and is being input. But I will say my process also does incorporate what you were talking about, using images as kind of a basis. You can certainly feed your own images into custom data sets that are then incorporated in the process. But I find that just depending on the project, sometimes I may, play around with recursion, where I'm putting in like starting with my own initial image, then playing with text to see how it becomes manipulated, and then maybe go through multiple variations before I reach kind of an end point, an end image where I'm like, oh, this is interesting. Okay, well, let's continue this conversation. Let me use that now as the initial image and change up the text. It becomes a really fun, recursive process that isn't simply about back and forth on a like singular text prompt, singular image, but one that starts incorporating more lenses, so to speak.
Wild. How do you respond? I mean, look, this whole conversation, I think this isn't really a question, but this whole conversation is a response to, and I'm sure you felt this a bunch, is AI art? And I think the answer always is, anything that is worthy of exploring creatively and curious with an open mind is art. Why do you think people are scared?
I think with every I mean, people are always scared with every new thing that comes out. I think I talk to my parents and people of their generation, and I think they've still got Skynet and Terminator in their minds as far as like any kind of neural networks or machine intelligence is concerned. But I mean, even looking at like when the web first emerged, like look at Web 1, like people were scared of that because they were thinking that it would demolish the things that they held dear.
To be fair, it kind of did.
It did. I think in a lot of ways, there was a lot of good that came out of, there's a lot of good that comes out of these evolutionary processes. And it always forces us to kind of collectively reevaluate these things, exactly these values and these ideologies that we hold dear. Yeah. So I think people will always be scared. But as these technologies become much more prevalent and pervasive, there hopefully will be more benefits that abound.
So I think that's definitely been thematic, right? We have this idea of like the loss of subculture, kind of this transitioning into more of this like connected oneness. And I think that is probably what is fearful for people, right? Like the loss of that very local group identity and having to kind of ascend into more of this global collective identity. And that was also like very exciting for me because capitalism purports like the individual in that system, but crypto art in the beginning was very much about like the collective and supporting the community and, the people that supported you, lifting them up alongside you.
Yeah. And I think, that kind of speaks to some broader themes that are going on in the technology space about, there's the question of now, what does it mean to be human, and then on the other hand, what does it mean to be post-human? I mean, I think we're still kind of in the transhuman phase where we're figuring out where we're headed. But when it comes to the question, what does it mean to be human? I hold pretty staunchly that it is about a search for autonomy and agency in light of perceptions of things that might, empower or diminish that, that individualism. But when you think about the question, what does it mean to be post-human? I'm actually thinking about, the word sentience. Once again, speaking to this mindfulness and awareness that isn't necessarily about negating individual opinion and thought and choice, but it's one that's certainly more aware of the consequences and ripple effect that one's choices make.
Powerful. It's, we're at time. This is, I think it's a wonderful synthesis of the conversation because it is so multidimensional in that like the individuals are continuing to be empowered through these technologies, blockchain, AI, but they are kind of like coming to terms with the collective, right? And they are able to begin to experience more, and they are being kind of lifted up on a quicker evolutionary, whatever, transhuman narrative, right? All of us just being open to kind of like figuring it out. And it is just a wonderful, fascinating time. And I really just like, thank you for the time and your insights. You've made me think a lot.
I'm so glad. No, thank you. And thank you for such probing questions. They've certainly had, my mind is now spinning and will continue to
well, yeah, hopefully we can spin some other people out as well. The last word is yours. Please let people know where they can find you and anything else you might want to share.
Sure. I'll just keep it logistical. You can find me on Twitter at Connie Bakshi. Just one word, ConnieBakshi. Same on Instagram for some more long form writing. And of course, there's my link tree in both. So if you want to find out a little bit more about me, my work, what's out there with my name attached to it, feel free to click away.
All right, so now we say goodbye. I am Colborn Bell. I was joined by artist Connie Bakshi. Shout out to DMINTI for putting us together. And it's been a real pleasure. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Well,
bye, everyone.
Catch you later.
Breaking news.